The German humorous illustrator and artist Adolf Hengeler was born in 1863 in the town of Kempten, in the southeast of the country. In 1878, when he was 15, he took an apprenticeship as a lithographer before studying at the School of Applied Art in Munich. Even as a student, he was having work published in the humour magazine Fliegende Blätter, and would continue to do so almost exclusively for 2 more decades. So by the time he graduated, he was already well known in publishing, and he was also moderately successful as a painter. And from quite early on in his career, his cartoons were regularly compiled into albums, all of which sold well. By far the majority of his work was monochrome and rendered with remarkable dexterity in pen and ink. Some was printed as line only, and others used additional grey washes of watercolour to provide greater definition to the various elements of the picture. He was particularly adept at capturing nuances of expression in his subjects, and although highly comedic, his characters resonated with recognisable plausibility. On the relatively rare occasion he got to use colour, the same method was used with considerable visual appeal, and it's a great pity there aren't more examples to be had. He had a particular fondness for group scenes in which some form of anarchy or disaster was taking place, and he was highly skilled at creating interplay between the various characters involved. In addition to his ongoing commitment to Fliegende, he also found time to create some particularly agreeable children's bookwork, unfortunately none of it in colour. Nevertheless, they were highly absorbing and entertaining, with some nice anthropomorphic touches. And from the later 19th into the 20th century, his work was well known throughout German-speaking countries by both adults and children. In 1912, Hengeler's reputation led to his appointment as a professor at Munich Academy, and he continued in that role up to 1925. When war broke out in 1914, he was 51 and not expected to fight, but during the years of the war his style changed radically, and he created propagandist material using a rough crayon technique in both colour and monochrome. That many of his students had not made it back from the war had a profound effect on him, and this may or may not have been the reason he largely abandoned satirical work, although I did find a couple of crayon examples from the 1920s. But the rest of his life was spent almost exclusively as an artist, while continuing with his role as an academic, and Adolf Hengeler died in 1927 in Munich at the age of 64. Achille Beltrame was born in 1871 in Arsignano, Italy, and he later enrolled into the Brera Academy in Milan. Following his art training, he started working for the Ricordi Studios in Milan in 1896, creating postcards which were used to promote the many operas being staged in the city at the time. And for the same studio he created several theatrical posters which also showed a talent for more graphic visual approaches. In 1899 his work came to the attention of the publisher Luigi Albertini, and he was impressed enough with Beltrame's work to immediately offer him the job of art director and illustrator for his Sunday supplement Domenico del Corriere. And although he also worked with some success throughout his life as a painter, for the best part of half a century that was Beltrame's virtually sole vehicle of expression as an illustrator. At this time, and for some time to come, photography was still monochrome only and didn't reproduce all that well, and to record any event the photographer had to physically be wherever it occurred. But Beltrame was possessed of a combination of great visual imagination and draftsmanship, which enabled him to record all manner of global events from the comfort of his studio. And throughout the first decade of the 20th century, his frequently melodramatic but always compelling visualizations of any number of wars, catastrophes and politically potent moments were published on the cover and in the supplements pages for the edification of the readers. In 1914 he created a cover illustrating the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand at Sarajevo, the event which escalated rapidly into the Great War. And following this, naturally enough, the war became the dominant topic for Beltrame to illustrate. In this conflict, Italy fought with the Allies against Germany, and he visualised many scenes of major battles, recording heroic victories and defeats in roughly equal measure. As with all his illustrations, he actually never set foot anywhere near the location of any of these battles, and yet still somehow achieved highly plausible outcomes. During the conflict, he also created some striking but more sedate covers for the magazine La Lettura. Once Germany had been defeated in 1918, he returned to other Italian and world events and disasters as the country adjusted to what would be an uneasy peace. In the 1920s, when Benito Mussolini and his supporters increasingly dominated Italian politics, Beltrame continued to create more of his usual series of disasters and events without reference to the political upheavals taking place in the country. But by the 1930s, he was producing a large volume of imagery in support of Mussolini and portrayed him heroically as the world once more headed inevitably for another war. Under Mussolini, Italy was allied with Germany this time around, and Beltrame's work reflects that in the wartime illustrations he produced. But in 1941 he retired and handed his role over to the equally talented younger illustrator Walter Merlino in 1941, and he died in Milan in 1945 at the age of 73. Lucien Bernhard was born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1883 as Emil Kahn, but for unknown reasons changed his name in 1905. It's recorded that he studied, but only very briefly, at the Munich Academy and was otherwise self-taught. He moved to Berlin in 1901, where he worked as a poster designer and art director for magazines, and within a few years he'd become one of a small group of illustrators and designers who were instrumental in the creation of Plakatstil, which translates from the German to the pleasingly literal poster style. In 1905, his winning design for a poster competition held by the Priester Match Company did his reputation no harm, and many more similarly minimalist posters followed. Such was the success of this radical stylistic departure from what had preceded it, that by a year later, at the age of only 23, Bernhard opened his own studio with 30 employees. He and his Plakatstil associates used a reductive approach to their images and the application of flat non-representational colour. Ornamentation was considered redundant, and many of these posters dealt only with the inherent aesthetic presentation of whatever was being advertised. This no-nonsense discipline was also known as the equally literal Sachpalat, or object poster. Throughout the first decade of the century and into the second, his studio produced a large volume of posters for all manner of clients. Bernhard was employed by the German government during the First World War to produce propaganda posters, and oddly for these he used a more expressionistic though equally minimal approach, and his work played more on patriotic themes than attacking the enemy. After the war, he became a professor of poster design at the Berlin Royal Academy, but in 1923 Bernhard moved to the United States and traded on his reputation to create work for American clients who were attracted to his simple dynamic approach to image making at a time when most American advertising was far more traditionally rendered. In 1928 he teamed up with Rockwell Kent and others, including fellow German émigré Bruno Paul, to establish the New York design company Contempora. Throughout his early career in both Germany and the USA, Bernhard had enjoyed particular success as a designer of typefaces, and on occasion this aspect of his abilities fed into the posters and other publicity work he created. His work in this period continued to be in demand from a wide range of clients, and among others, he produced a particularly large volume for Amoco Oil, which ran from the later 1940s into the 1950s with great success. Although his later work continued to adhere to the principles established in his earlier posters, by this point it had long since lost its novelty value and had been overtaken by more contemporary exponents of dynamic poster and advertising work to emerge in the USA. How long he continued to work in advertising I've been unable to find out, and the available evidence suggests he spent most of his later life as an artist, primarily painting female figures up to his death in 1972 at the age of 89. French illustrator Pierre Brissot was born in Paris in 1885, and like so many others who would become popular in 1920s France, his art education took place at the École des Beaux-Arts. In 1907, when he was 22 and just out of art school, Brissot found some early success, more for his work as an artist than for his illustration. But his exhibition of prints and watercolours drew him to the attention of Parisian publishers, and fashionable magazines offered him regular commissions to appear on their covers and in their pages. More than any other, it was the prestigious fashion magazine La Gazette du Bon Temps, which most commonly featured Brissot's illustrations. The great majority of these were printed using the pochoir method under Brissot's direction. Despite the laborious nature of this reprographic process, all his images possessed a spontaneous visual character, and his use of colour to create light and shade in his work was a particularly attractive atmospheric feature. But it wasn't all fashion work, and he also illustrated the book Eugénie Grandet by Honoré de Balzac in 1913, with both colour and monochrome page illustrations. And in the following year he produced a typically stylish and elegant press advertisement for Renault cars. In virtually all his work, Brissot's characters were placed within integral scenic backdrops, which frequently gave his fashion illustrations a strong suggestion of some form of narrative, which successfully held the viewer's attention more than most. And this quality contributed to his continued popularity in fashion circles throughout the decade and well into the 1920s. In 1925, he illustrated the erotic story Le Leçon d'amour dans un parc, written by René Boislev. And although frequently featuring nudity and scenes of sexual dalliance, none of Brissot's highly decorative scenes from the narrative could be considered in any way vulgar. In that year, the owners of Vogue magazine bought out the Gazette, and naturally enough from this point on, his work started to feature in their pages too, and not just in the French editions. This high-profile international exposure consequently led to him making numerous contributions to other American magazines, including House and Garden, in the later 1920s and the 1930s. But in that decade he increasingly turned to book illustration, in particular a series of classics for George Macy's Heritage Press. Brissot's first commission was for a 1935 edition of Manon Lescaut, written by the Abbé Prévost in 1731. But by this point he was much less prolific, and it was 1944 before he published Edmond Rostand's Cyrano de Bergerac. And there followed a similar gap before his edition of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary was published in 1950. But all his book projects, including 1954's edition of Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, maintained the same high standards of visual appeal as his earlier output. Sadly, the same couldn't be said of his last published work, a series of comparatively loosely drawn lithographic historical prints dating from 1959 when he was 74 years old. And Pierre Brissot died 5 years later in 1964 at the age of 79. So that's it for now, and I hope you found something here to hold your interest. See you soon with more of one kind or another, I hope.